There's no place like home anymore. Seems so far away.
Cruising Britain's inland waterways certainly looks like a great way to unwind. Completed 173 years ago, this section of Britain's canal system, now called the Shropshire Union Canal, runs roughly north-south from Otherley Junction near Wolverhampton, through Staffordshire, Shropshire and Cheshire to where it joins the Manchester Ship Canal at Ellesmere Port near Liverpool. 8 miles or so from Otherley Junction, our boaters can look forward to a spot of exercise as they reach the only lock in a 24-mile stretch of canal here in the Staffordshire village of Wheaton Aston. The lock here has a 7-foot drop, the biggest drop of any lock on this canal. Our boaters might be looking forward to a spot of lunch as they pause to operate the paddles in the only single lock on the system. The rest are in flights. If our boaters look over to the west, they will see the tower of a church. This may well signal a chance to replenish supplies or to buy a stamp or a postal order at the nearby village. But if they read their guidebook, they might be a bit disappointed to find that Wheaton Aston holds little interest for the boater. Can this really be true? This is Bridge 18, known locally as Narmansley Bridge, after the fields on either side. It was positioned here by the canal builders to link 2 villages, 2 churches. If our boaters were to follow a path eastwards across the fields, they could explore the village of Lapley, just a little too far away to command a mention in the guidebook. I'm curious. Lapley. What's at Lapley? Let's go and have a look. Come on, get your boots on. Oh dear, no chance of shopping here then. You haven't even been able to buy a stamp here since the last postmistress died back in 1963. And now, in 2008, even the last pub has closed. But Lapley does have some interesting grand old houses, Grade 2 listed. Lapley has clearly been a place of some importance. But what our boaters will probably not realise is that both Lapley and Wheaton Aston are very old villages and have fascinating histories. The 2 villages have developed quite separately and have evolved different characters, despite being in the same parish and manor for 1,000 years. But one building here in Lapley is listed Grade 1. Something a bit special. This is the parish church of Old Lapley Parish. All Saints is a very important historical building. Few churches in England are older. Yes! Yes, it's been messed with over the centuries, but the basic church is still the same church that was here in the 11th century.
The idea of parishes goes back even further, to the 10th century. The Saxon bishops decided that the country should be divided up into areas of population of a suitable size, and a priest or vicar appointed. England in those far-off days was a country of isolated farms and small villages, often little more than hamlets. A parish was often made up of several of these hamlets. Lapley is quite a small parish in area, indicating that in those times it was relatively heavily populated.
For 900 years or so, until the end of the 19th century, the most important person in the village was the lord of the manor. The manor was his estate, and in the early medieval days he owned the village people as well. In the case of Lapley and Wheaton Aston, the parish and the manor covered roughly the same area.
Lapley first emerges in writing in 1061, when it was given to the Abbey of Saint Remy in Reims in France. It gets a second mention 27 years later in William the Conqueror's famous Domesday Survey. Wheaton Aston, then called simply Aston, has to wait another 100 years for its first mention as one of the possessions of the abbey, but that was not the beginning. The 27 families listed in Lapley in the Domesday Survey in 1086 did not appear overnight. Their ancestors had been here for hundreds of years. We don't know when the area was first settled, but we do know that nearly 2,000 years ago the Romans were near here, building forts to protect themselves from the local Iron Age people. One of the biggest assets that the Romans left us is the roads that they built. The route of many have been continued to be followed ever since, but others have disappeared. A road that they built between nearby Stretton and Whitchurch disappears here into the fields. This section of the same road, however, that runs by Lapley, has never, during all of its 1900 years of life, fallen into disuse. People have been living around here continuously since the Roman times. So the year 1061 brought to Lapley the Roman Catholic order of Benedictine monks from the mighty abbey in St Remy in Reims in France. They were the new lords of the manor, and from now on what they said counted in this part of the world. The Lapley estate had been given to them by the Earls of Mercia, along with 4 other smaller estates in the Midlands. These were the Staffordshire villages of Marsden, Hampstall Ridware and Mereford, and one in Shropshire high on the Clee Hills at Silvington.
It is likely that a small order of 2 or 3 monks were sent here from Reims shortly after 1061 to set up a priory cell here. Of the 5 places given, Lapley was chosen to be the centre of administration and the site for the new priory. Neighbouring Marston was managed by the priors and the others were leased out. Perhaps the site of Lapley was chosen because there was already a church or a manor house here.
Or conversely, perhaps, because it was remote and quiet, the way the early priories liked to be. From the evidence on the ground, the priory buildings were unusually to the north of the church. This site was vacated by the monks in 1414, and although there's still a lot to be seen today, the site amazingly has never been considered worth excavating or preserving.
Fortunately, that gives us the opportunity to do a bit of speculating.
Life at the time of the arrival of the monks was unbelievably different from our own. In 1061 they were living in an age of extreme class distinction. Ruling the country were the aristocracy, the knights, the fighting class, about 5% of the population. Then there were those who prayed, monks and clergymen like themselves, who made up another 5%. And at the bottom, those who worked, the peasants or villeins who made up the remainder. The aristocracy ruled from their castles. They kept order by being merciless. They looked after their monks, enabling them to oversee their peasants. The peasants were treated like slaves. They were tied to the manor and could be bought and sold. They lived under the monks' laws. The monks could even administer the death penalty if they so wished. And they were French. All of that did nothing to increase their popularity.
What the new priors needed, as well as a church and a home, was a fortress. And it's the remains of this that we find on the site today. The heart of the fortress was the only all-stone building on the site, the church.
The church we see today is very unusual. It has a central tower between a chancel and a nave. This is not quite right. Something is missing.
Now it's time to have a look at Lapley Church in a little more detail and see if we can't find the church that the priors knew. We can be pretty sure that the church that the priors knew was built on a cruciform plan that was very popular in France and used by the Romans. Small wings would have been attached to either side of the tower called transepts. It seems that at some point they've been demolished. We can see what remains of the entrance of the north transept in the shape of this walled-up arch.
And the south transept arch used to be visible on the other side of the tower, as shown in this early 19th century drawing. And what appears to be the remains of the south transept walls, which had apparently been left in place as buttresses, can be seen on this other 19th century painting, done before the tower was repaired in 1865. Can we still see the remains of the transepts scattered around Lapley today?
Strangely, the main body of the church, called the nave, and the chancel to the east of the tower are not in line.
This is very rare, and the most popular reason put forward for this anomaly is that it represents the head of Christ weeping as he hung on the cross.
It is called a weeping chancel. Now we have another theory, but it's a bit speculative, but anyway, here goes. Churches are always said to have been built east to west. Well, this is only partly true.
We say that the sun rises in the east. Again, this is only partly true. Only at the spring and autumn equinox does this happen. On other days, it rises to the north or south of east. Churches very often are angled away from due east to align with the position on the horizon of the sunrise of the church's saints' vigil. There are several references in early documents to Lapley Church being dedicated to St. Peter. And in the 13th century, monks were granted a licence to hold an annual fair at Wheaton Aston on the vigil and day of St. Peter ad Vincula, St. Peter in chains, which is August the 1st.
Could it be that the church was built in two stages? The nave, built first, was found not to be correctly aligned with the sunrise on the saint's day. An attempt to correct the error was made when adding the tower and the chancel. Anyone fancy checking our theory next August the 1st? So what did the monks' church actually look like?
The top half of the central tower we see now is not original. It was not built until around 1475, half a century after the priors had left. It is generally agreed that the original tower that the priors knew was only half as high and had a pyramid roof. When the tower was made higher, and thus a lot heavier, about 400 years after it had first been built, the extra weight was too much for the old, crudely built structure with its round supporting arches. The arches leading to the transepts had to be filled to give the tower its extra strength. No longer properly accessible, the transepts were demolished. At the top of the original tower was a chamber that had several functions. Primarily, it was part of the fortress, a lookout over the surrounding area. The two windows on either side of the tower gave a good view in all directions, should the Vikings attack or the peasants revolt. The church was already built on high ground, but a few extra feet of the tower lifted their view above the trees. blocked up window we can see peeping out of the tower above today's roof line was once actually inside the church. The roof and the walls of both the chancel and the nave have at some time been lowered. From the lookout chamber in the tower, as well as viewing the outside world, the monks could look down into all the corners of the inside of the church. And finally, it was a bell chamber. Through the 8 windows, the church bell could be heard far and wide, calling the monks to prayer. The thick south wall of the nave is crudely built. Battle-scarred, it has a lot to tell us. It looks to be the oldest part of the church. Clearly, it once had 2 doors punched through it. When they were added, we don't know, but the arches appear to have been Gothic, that is, pointed, not round like the other arches in the original church, and therefore they were probably added a short time after the completion of the original church. The door nearest the tower was probably the entrance to a small chapel, which may have adjoined the south transept. The western one looks like it had a porch. Our artist again has been at work. Long since bricked up, the doorways are occupied now by 2 windows, 3 altogether on this wall. What we see today are the restored Victorian windows, made to look like they were from the 15th century. They had actually been added even earlier than that. They in turn replaced the original round arched windows from the 11th century. Can we see the stonework used to block them off above a couple of the existing windows?
Up until the mid-1200s, churches were normally built and owned by a private landlord. In Lapley, that was of course the monks. Around 1250, the established church started exerting its power in Lapley, and the monks were told to set aside lands for the upkeep of a vicar. A new vicarage was built, nothing posh mind, and a vicar appointed. It was probably somebody under local control of the priors. Adam Cornett is recorded as our first vicar around this time.
The arrival of the new vicar during the last half of the 13th century would appear to have sparked a few changes in the church building. It was now much more than just a priory church, it was a parish church as well. The chancel was extended, with a lovely new 5-light window, a new piscina for washing sacred vessels, and 3 new sedilia to accommodate the church hierarchy, all of which we can see today. A new door was added to allow the new vicar access from the vicarage via the churchyard. It is likely that this was the time that the windows and the nave were restyled. The main entrance moved to the west end of the chancel, and the church windows glazed. Inside the church, perhaps at the same time, one of the original 4 supporting arches below the tower was reworked, from a Norman round arch to a Gothic pointed arch to complement the window. And Wheaton Aston was not left out. The biggest settlement in the parish got a nice new chapel of ease.
Around the back here of the church, the chancel had a door which led to the priory. And these corbels tells us that there were priory buildings up against these walls.
On this north wall, if we ignore the 2 rectangular windows which date from after the priory was disbanded, there were no windows on this side of the church.
This suggests not only that the priory buildings were against this wall, but also that this was one wall of their fortress. So where were the other walls?
Well, they were not exactly walls. The priory buildings stood on the north side of the church. What is called Old Manor occupies the site now, and we feel sure that at least some part of that building belonged to the priory. Normally, priories and abbey buildings are positioned to the south of their church, so why was Lapley Priory any different? Was the graveyard already here on the south side of the church, preventing them from building their new priory there? The church had to be accessible to the public. The defensible area needed to enclose the priory, but not the church. And this is how we think they did it. From what is left today, we can see what was enclosed, and at least two sides were defended by a moat. It has been suggested that the moat may have enclosed the whole priory site, including the church. What we see on the ground today does not bear that theory out.
A lot of moat still exists, and some of it's in pretty good condition too. This section to the north was almost 12 feet deep. And it wouldn't take very much to fill it with water and get it back going again. The fourth side, today's road, may have been moated, or it may simply have been a rampart. The gate and main entrance was probably here, where the gate is to the manor house now. Over 350 years there have been many changes here. Basically this was their garden. And this hollow here could possibly have been their fish pond, stocked with carp.
Like good Catholics, fish was always eaten on Fridays. The Benedictine monks would have tried to have been self-sufficient. The site would have contained the main hall, kitchen, gatehouse, guest house, stable, cowshed, pigsties, grain store, workshops, orchard and vegetable patch.
Close by would have been a windmill and a dovecot. Well, where they all were, we can only guess. You see, the site is not considered worth excavating. Could be a case for Tony Robinson and Channel 4's Time Team.
It would have been the monks who first organised our villages from groups of scattered farmsteads into the classic medieval form. Manors controlled by religious houses were usually the first to organise. Medieval villages were largely self-sufficient groups of houses or farms, with a manor house and a church, surrounded by open arable fields. Beyond the arable fields were wastes or common lands, which supplies firewood, timber for building, fencing and game. Lowlands and wetlands were kept for one of the village's most important crops, hay. The farmsteads usually consisted of a homestead or a longhouse with living quarters at one end for the family and an area at the other end for the animals. Built of wattle and daub, that is, of sticks and mud. Not one house of this type has survived in England to the present day. The close or croft at the back of the house could be quite substantial, subdivided into a vegetable garden, orchard and animal pens for a cow, pig and fowl. And there would have been storage for grain.
So where were these homesteads? I thought we said that they were built of mud and that there was nothing left for us to find. Well, the houses may have gone, but the croft boundaries are still fossilised in today's boundaries. To find out where some of them were, we must turn to Wheaton Aston and the oldest map that we have that shows the village in any detail.
It was drawn by schoolmaster Thomas Martin in 1836, probably with the help of surveyors who may have been mapping the village at the time for the tithe map. What makes it so remarkable is that it's been coloured to identify the owners of the properties. Thanks to Thomas's patient watercolouring, we can clearly see the crofts and their boundaries as they were in 1836. Actually, they're not too different from the crofts we see in the village today. There is no reason to suppose that the boundaries had changed for centuries before. It has even been suggested that these boundaries go back to Saxon times, and they're still here. Medieval villages were largely self-sufficient groups of houses or farms, with a manor house and a church, surrounded by open arable fields.
So where are these open arable fields? Well, even Thomas Martin's map isn't old enough to show us these. Or is it?
The open fields of the Middle Ages were large, unfenced fields, divided into strips. Some villages had only 2 or 3 fields. Aston seems to have had more. The fields and strips were usually about 220 yards long. This was known as a furlong or furrow long. Each villein and border was allocated enough strips for his needs. Different crops were grown side by side, cereals mainly. The lord of the manor had most strips, usually as many as a third of the total, and the peasant farmers had to plough and harvest these strips as well as their own. Martin's map shows hints of strip farming in the fields within the village that are now built over. Other clues to their whereabouts are in the field names and the field shapes. Fields that are still called furlong are one way to tell.
Another way is to look for fields that have a distinctive, special shape. Fields that show the ridge and furrows of ancient ploughings. But more about that later. Here in Lapley, the ridge and furrows are harder to find. Most of Lapley's ridge and furrows were ploughed up long ago. For Lapley's open fields, we must look for clues somewhere else.
So no map, no ridge and furrow. What have we got? Open field farming used 3 or more large fields close to the village. The fields were often given the names ending in field. Field names survive the centuries.
Lapley has some large, gentle, sloping fields that look as though they would have made perfect open fields. So what are their names? Well, this field is called Dovehouse Field. This one is called Windmill Field. There's 2 riddles there solved at once. We now know where the open fields were, and we also know where the priory had its dovecot and windmill. The priory was largely unsuccessful in its 350 years of life at Lapley. It went through periods of poverty and reported misbehaviour by the monks. We would guess that in the early days, the position of prior at Lapley was not a popular posting for an educated French-speaking monk from Saint-Romain's. Lapley seemed a million miles away from the life and company that they had been used to in the massive abbey in Reims. Accommodation was poor and the wine undrinkable. The population, to say the least, was unwelcoming. Equating a life of prayer and that of stern lord of the manor, doling out punishments and collecting heriots, was difficult. But the posting did have some advantages.
They were a long way from home, and anyone who has worked away from home will tell you there is little to stop them resisting temptation.
As part of their training, the most promising young monks from Reims were selected to take up a position at Lapley, and they found they had little affinity with the place. Over the next 100 years, the unloved new priory became a run-down shadow of its former self. Roofs leaked, defences were neglected, and the rents were uncollected. In 1162, Pierre de Selle, abbot of St. Romain's in Reims, wrote to the prior of Worcester about the problems with Lapley and about his intention of replacing the prior of Lapley, Brother P, with the hard-working Brother Orello. Of poor Brother P, he complained.
We hear evil rumours of his priorship every time we receive overseas visitors from those parts. The priory is crumbling and is reduced to nothing. It is kept in abject poverty.
Things did not improve, and the abbot was forced to write another letter explaining that he could no longer wait for better fruit from the fig tree that is Lapley.
I am putting the axe radically to the tree, not cutting the trunk, but making light the branches, drooping to the ground in the hope that they will be laden with fruit once again.
Brothers of fresh thought were sent from Rheims.
In the 13th century, things seem to have looked up a little when the chancel of Lapley Church was extended and the new east window added. A new chapel at Wheaton Aston may date from this time. A new watermill was built at Aston, and the priors were granted a licence to hold a weekly market and annual fair there.
But the 14th century brought the priory to its knees. Events conspired to ruin the prior's attempts to modernise.
One thing was famine and a mini ice age. In 1314, heavy rain destroyed the harvest. Bitter winters followed. Food shortages continued in 1315, 1316 and 1317.
Another setback to the priors was the heavy taxation levied by the newly crowned King Edward III.
Edward needed to recapture control over the Scots following his father's disastrous defeat at Bannockburn. Looking back over the centuries, he did us a small favour. He needed to raise taxes. In 1332, in a subsidy roll, are listed the names of the principal copyholders of the manor at Lapley and Aston. 25 of them. Now, for the first time in our history, we know some names. These names come from a time when people were beginning to get surnames for the first time. The names may well tell us a little bit about where they came from, what they did, where they lived, and even what they looked like. But some of these people were customary tenants of the manor. They were serfs, the working class. The law under which they served was designed to keep them down. They did not have freedom. It would take an act of God to give them that. And that act is only a few years away.
If the early monks disliked Lapley, then one 14th century prior felt very much attached to the place. For 30 years, against all odds, he managed to hang on to the priory despite the concerted efforts by everyone else to unseat him. His name was Baldwin. During this period, his connection with the Mother Abbey seemed less important to him than his relations with the Crown. He'd better watch out. In an age of much disorder throughout England, there appears in 1334 to have been a minor civil war at the Priory. Baldwin of Spinale would appear to have been the established prior when two fresh faces appeared at his door, claiming to have been sent from Rheims to administer the priory. Baldwin appealed to the bishop to arbitrate his claim over the new arrivals. Gobbert of Lappian and his fellow monk John Lang were upheld. Both priors, however, were granted royal protection for a year. The unsatisfactory settlement only served to continue the dispute. The new monks took refuge in Aston and whipped up support amongst the peasants. Was this an opportunity to get rid of a hated landlord and put an end to serfdom? They decided that they would go to Lapley and evict Baldwin. The resulting raid on the priory erupted into anger. The mob, which included the vicar of Lapley, broke into the priory shouting, "Away with serfdom! Away with Baldwin and his bailiffs!" Baldwin heard them coming and in fear of his life fled the priory.
The angry mob broke through the gates. They drove off 40 of his ox, 15 bullocks, 15 heifers and 40 swine. They broke into the priory chests, determined to destroy records of their subjugation. The deeds in the parish records went up in smoke through the priory chimney.
But Baldwin survived. The courts and the knights came to his rescue. The prior's troubles continued in the form of King Edward III's war with France. In 1337, Edward III began his campaign to recapture not only England's former French possessions in Aquitaine, but also to capture the French throne. The war would last for over 100 years.
In 1338, during these times of war with France, the right of the prior to be tenant-in-chief and to collect the rents was taken from the French monks and given to secular persons. Without the income, the priors were often in great distress. The priors were unable to perform their customary alms, charities, and divine services.
In response to the king's demands for more money to pay for his wars, the new secular landlords increased their rent, which the poor farmers of the manor just couldn't pay. In exchange, the king's men took timber from the woods and other property from the priory.
The prior appealed to the king to be allowed to extend the amount of land that he farmed in the manor.
In a survey done for the court, we are given for the first time since the Domesday Book some idea of the extent of the manors of Lapley and Wheaton Aston.
This is also the first time that we find the prefix Wheaton used in print. So, in 1338, there were 13 tenants at Lapley and 40 in Wheaton Aston. 53 families. There had been 27 in 1086. The population had doubled in 250 years. The prior holds 160 acres of land and open fields at Lapley. The tenants probably hold twice as much, about 320 acres. At Lapley there is a decayed dovecot and a windmill. At Wheaton Aston the prior has a mesoage called Le Motte and a watermill.
Following the hearing, the prior's wish was granted and he got his extra land. More troubles followed by the worst blow of all, the act of God, plague and fire.
On the 25th of June, 1348, the first germs of the greatest natural disaster ever to hit the human race entered England via the south coast port of Melcombe Regis. Spreading at a rate of 1 kilometre a day, the great bubonic plague, known as the Black Death, reached Lapley and Wheaton Aston in the spring of 1349. No one was safe from its grasp. From the first symptoms, an agonising death usually followed within hours. In towns, half the population died. The aftershock would be felt for generations.
The world was now a very different place. It would never be the same again. And then, for the priory, it just went and got worse.
Fire broke out in the priory, which burned down all of the priory buildings, except for one chamber, 3 barns, and also partly damaged the church. The life of the prior had until this time been one of relative comfort, but now he had nothing. His home had been destroyed, and the pestilence that had lately raged had decimated his workforce. His 2 watermills and 1 windmill were overthrown and worth nothing. His fish ponds had dried up, and his rental income drastically reduced. He was unable to carry out his duties as a vicar and could not afford to rebuild the priory. He could not pay his rent to the king. He was forced to go round the country, begging for his bread.
The French Queen Mother came to his rescue. He was excused his arrears and the future rents were decreased. The priory was again in the hands of the king's men. In the same year, 1354, Lapley got a new vicar and a new chaplain.
The new vicar was John de Ingleton, and his appointed chaplain was Thomas Cotterell. Cotterell may have had special responsibilities for Wheaton Aston, for in 1362 he inherited from the prior's bailiff, John de Nosal, some copyhold land in Aston. Thomas left Wheaton Aston and went on to higher things. Among his other achievements, he became Canon of Lincoln Cathedral, where he was eventually buried. If he had started life as the son of a serf, the changes brought about by the Black Death enabled him to rise to dizzy heights in the established church.
But he never lost his ties with Wheaton Aston. Towards the end of his life, he established a chantry of a chaplain at the Church of the Holy Trinity in Wheaton Aston to pray for the souls of the kings, various other royals, himself and his family.
From 1362, he dropped the name Cotterell and became Thomas de Aston. Thomas seems to have been a favourite with the people from Aston, a local Englishman instead of one of those Frenchy priors.
It was Shakespeare's warlike Harry, Henry V, who finally put an end to the priory.
The ongoing war with France took him to the end of his tether. Annoyed with the stream of English money going abroad, in 1414, in the first years of his reign, Henry put an end to all of England's alien priories.
The priors were sent home, and the manor of Aston and Lapley were put up for sale.
The country that no longer wanted the priors at Lapley in 1414 was a very different one to that which welcomed them 350 years before. The Black Death had finally brought serfdom to an end. The manor courts still existed, but their powers were much reduced. They existed mainly to run the day-to-day matters of the manor, and would continue to do so for another 600 years. The next 100 years or so after 1414 would turn out to be a golden age for priories and monasteries in England. If the priory had survived longer into the 15th century, who knows what a different place the parish of Lapley and Wheaton Aston would be today.